January 7th, 1945, Brussels. Late afternoon, in a smoke-filled press room still rattling from weeks of German artillery, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stepped before the microphones with the confidence of a man who believed history already belonged to him. Outside, the Battle of the Bulge was still smoldering. Snow lay thick on the Ardennes. More than 80,000 Allied casualties had been counted. The war was not yet won. Montgomery spoke anyway. He spoke at length. He spoke with certainty. And he spoke as if no one else mattered. The British Field Marshal described the Allied response to Hitler's last great offensive as a plan he had personally seized, reshaped, and saved. American armies battered and bloodied in December were reduced to supporting actors in his telling. The crisis, he implied, had required British clarity and British command. He had been the calm hand, the steady mind, the indispensable general. Reporters took notes. Correspondents exchanged glances. Across the Atlantic, the words would read like an insult, but in Europe, the damage was immediate. That evening, transcripts reached Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. They were delivered to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man entrusted with holding together the most fragile coalition in modern warfare. British, American, Canadian, free French millions of men, bound by necessity, not affection. Eisenhower read every line. He read the quiet dismissal of American sacrifice. He read the self-praise. He read the suggestion, unspoken but unmistakable, that Allied victory had required Montgomery to take charge because others could not be trusted. For weeks, Eisenhower had absorbed criticism in silence. He had endured Montgomery's private lectures, his memos dripping with condescension, his refusal to accept orders without commentary. He had done so because unity mattered more than pride. But this was different. This was public, this was recorded, this would echo through newspapers and capitals. And it struck at the one thing Eisenhower could not allow to fracture: confidence between allies in the middle of a war still very much alive. The room was quiet when Eisenhower finally looked up. Those present would later say his face did not change. But something had hardened. To understand the weight of that moment, one had to understand the man Eisenhower had spent months protecting. Bernard Montgomery was not merely a field commander. He was Britain's last great land hero, the victor of El Alamein, the general who had stopped Rommel and restored British pride when defeat had seemed inevitable. In London, he was untouchable. In the press, he was celebrated. And in his own mind, he was indispensable. From the moment he arrived in Normandy in June 1944, Montgomery had made his position clear. He would cooperate with American forces, but never quietly. He questioned plans publicly. He criticized his peers privately. And when success came, he claimed it with surgical precision. Eisenhower tolerated it because he had to. The Allied command structure was a political invention as much as a military one. American industry supplied the war. American divisions now outnumbered British ones nearly 2-to-1. Yet Britain demanded prestige, visibility, and respect equal to its sacrifice. Montgomery was the symbol of that demand. The Supreme Commander understood the danger. If Montgomery were humiliated or removed, London would erupt. Churchill would intervene. Unity could fracture. Hitler, watching closely, would exploit the weakness. So Eisenhower swallowed insult after insult. Until the Ardennes. On December 16, 1944, Hitler had launched his final gamble 30 Division, smashing through thin American lines in freezing fog. Entire regiments were surrounded. Towns like Bastogne became names etched in blood. For days, Allied command teetered on the edge of chaos. Eisenhower responded decisively. He shifted armies. He reinforced threatened sectors. And, critically, he placed the northern shoulder of the Bulge to American armies temporarily under Montgomery's command for operational coordination. It was a practical choice. Nothing more. Montgomery interpreted it as validation. In the weeks that followed, American forces absorbed the brunt of the counterattack. The U.S. First and Third Armies lost over 60,000 men. Patton turned his army 90 degrees in 3 days. Units fought surrounded, frozen, and outnumbered. Montgomery arrived late. He advanced cautiously. He delayed offensives to ensure proper preparation. And when the Germans finally broke, he spoke as if the victory had required his personal intervention. That was what Eisenhower read on January 7. A narrative was being written, one that cast Americans as reckless, and Montgomery as the savior who restored order. It threatened not only morale, but authority. If left unanswered, it would define the war's final months. Eisenhower called his senior staff together. He did not raise his voice. He spoke of trust, of command, of the danger of one man placing himself above the alliance. Then he said something few had ever heard him say: "I will not command a coalition where loyalty is optional." That night, Eisenhower began drafting a message. It was not emotional, it was not long, but it was final. January 8, 1945, Supreme Headquarters, Versailles. Before dawn, sat alone at his desk, the room lit by a single lamp. Outside, staff cars moved silently through the cold. The war pressed forward regardless of personal conflict. But inside that room, the future of Allied command was being decided line by line. The message was addressed to Field Marshal Montgomery. It was blunt. Eisenhower reminded him that Allied victory rested on mutual confidence, not personal acclaim. He stated, without embellishment, that Montgomery's public statements had undermined American forces at a moment when tens of thousands of their men were still fighting and dying. He made clear that such behavior could not continue. Then came the sentence that changed everything. If Montgomery could not support the Supreme Commander loyally and publicly, Eisenhower would request his immediate relief from command. There were no qualifiers, no diplomatic padding, no appeal to friendship or past service. It was an ultimatum. Eisenhower understood the risk. Removing Montgomery would ignite a political firestorm in London. Churchill had already clashed with American leaders over strategy, resources, and post-war influence. This could shatter what remained of British leverage on the continent, but Eisenhower also understood something else. The war's balance had shifted. American divisions now carried the front. American generals planned the final drive into Germany. American industry dictated tempo. Command without authority was fiction, and coalition unity could not survive public insubordination. Once written, the message could not be unwritten. Before it was sent, Eisenhower shared its contents with a select few: Omar Bradley, Walter Bedell Smith. Their reaction was immediate. If Montgomery refused, Eisenhower would have to follow through. Anything less would end his credibility. The message was delivered. In Brussels, Montgomery received it in silence. For the first time in the war, the Field Marshal faced a choice he could not maneuver around. He could not lecture. He could not delay. He could not ebeel over Eisenhower's head without consequences.
The calculus was brutal. To refuse would mean removal, humiliation, and the end of British moral authority in Allied ground operations. To comply would mean something Montgomery had avoided his entire career: public submission. He convened his staff. The atmosphere was tense. The man who had built his legend on certainty now confronted uncertainty. Montgomery drafted a response. He agreed to issue a statement. He would acknowledge the indispensable role of American forces. He would clarify that the Allied victory in the Ardennes had been a collective effort under Eisenhower's supreme command. The apology was carefully worded, controlled, but unmistakable. On January 9, 1945, Montgomery faced the press again. This time, he spoke of unity. He praised American courage. He emphasized Eisenhower's leadership. The words were correct. The tone was restrained. Those who knew him understood the cost. The Field Marshal had not been defeated on a battlefield. He had been compelled. The reaction was immediate and unequivocal. American headquarters received Montgomery's statement with relief, not forgiveness. The damage had been contained, but not erased. Officers who had buried men in the frozen forests of Belgium did not forget who had claimed the credit while the ground was still warm with blood. The apology was accepted because it had to be. The war demanded it. In London, the mood was colder. Churchill read the transcripts carefully. He understood what had happened, even if it was never stated openly. Britain's most celebrated general had been brought to heel by an American supreme commander. The symbolism was impossible to miss. Britain was still a great power, but no longer the dominant one on the continent. Montgomery himself changed, not in temperament, not in ego, but in behavior. From that moment forward, his public statements were cautious. His briefings were cleared. His correspondence is more restrained. He continued to argue in private, continued to push for deliberate advances and tightly controlled operations. But the open defiance was gone. Eisenhower had drawn a line, and it held. The final months of the war unfolded under that new reality. The Rhine was crossed in March. The Ruhr was encircled. German resistance collapsed with accelerating speed. By May 7, 1945, the war in Europe was over. Through it all, Eisenhower's authority remained unquestioned. The crisis of January had clarified something essential. Supreme command now meant more than coordination. It meant enforcement. The coalition no longer balanced on British prestige. It rested on American leadership. Privately, Eisenhower never revisited the incident. He did not boast. He did not record triumph. In his view, it had not been a personal victory but a necessary act. Unity preserved by firmness, not indulgence. Montgomery, for his part, carried the wound quietly. In memoirs and later interviews, he never fully recanted his belief that he had saved the Ardennes front. But he also never again challenged Eisenhower in public. The lesson had been learned. For the men at the front, the consequences were abstract but real. Orders were clearer, command lines firmer, confusion diminished. The war's final operations unfolded with a discipline that coalition warfare rarely achieves. That discipline had been enforced not by gunfire, but by a single decision made in a quiet room, far from the front lines. An ultimatum written in ink. In the years after the war, the incident faded from official communiques, but it never vanished from history. The Allied victory in Europe would be remembered for beaches stormed and cities liberated, for flags raised over ruins and tyrants brought low. Yet beneath those images lay a quieter transformation, one measured not in miles advanced, but in authority transferred. January 1945 marked the end of an era. For 2 centuries, Britain had defined coalition warfare on land. British generals had commanded Allied armies against Napoleon. British strategy had shaped imperial conflicts across the globe. Even in this war, Britain entered first, endured longest, and stood alone when others fell. But by the winter of 1945, the arithmetic of power had changed. The United States fielded over 3 million soldiers in Europe. Its factories outproduced the Axis combined. Its generals planned the final campaigns. Its supreme commander now enforced unity not through persuasion, but through consequence. Montgomery's apology was more than a personal retreat. It was a signal, subtle but unmistakable, that the center of gravity had shifted westward across the Atlantic. Eisenhower emerged from the episode not as a charismatic battlefield commander, but as something rarer, a leader who could balance egos, absorb pressure, and still act decisively when delay became danger. His authority no longer depended on consensus alone. It had been tested, and it had held. For Montgomery, the war ended with rank intact and reputation complicated. He remained a field marshal. He received honors, but the myth of unquestioned dominance had cracked. He had discovered, too late, that coalition warfare in the modern age no longer rewarded individual glory. Contemporaries understood the significance even if they did not say it aloud. American officers spoke of January 1945 as the moment the alliance matured. British officials recognized it as the moment their leverage narrowed. Nothing could reverse it. The war had forced a reckoning, and Eisenhower's ultimatum had delivered it. Not with a battle, not with blood, but with words that could not be taken back.